reading today or tonight will be from Matthew 5:14 through 16. Matthew 5:14 through 16. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who enter the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. That's Matthew 5:14 through 16.
So we're going to talk about Isaac, the one in the Bible. This will make my nephew uptight. So if you want to go to Genesis 26, I'm going to point out some things about Isaac, the son of Abraham, that is similar to us. One thing is kind of similarity between us and Isaac is that we were both living in a place that we don't totally fit in, we don't totally belong. And I'm going to read parts of Genesis 26 and kind of sum up some of it, but I want to point out one particular verse, but we'll do this for context. Maybe you'll notice some other things that escaped your attention before. Genesis 26:1, now there was a famine in the land, besides the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. So Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. The Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give your descendants all these lands, and by your descendants all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. And you'll notice the word sojourn in verse 3. It basically means that he has no permanent location, and he's a stranger in a strange land. And that's essentially our situation. And you'll notice also that the promise that God gave to his dad, he's also giving to Isaac as well. So he's in this spot where he's surrounded by the world, so to speak, but he is meant to be a man of God. Then verse 12. And at one point, by the way, this is also when there's kind of a mix-up because of Isaac lying, and it kind of is straightened out. For our purposes, I'll just kind of sum it up with that. But if you jump down to verse 12, now Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and continued to grow richer until he became very wealthy, for he had possessions of flocks and herds and a great household, so that the Philistines envied him. Now all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father, the Philistines stopped up by filling them with earth. Then Abimelech, that's the guy we mentioned before, said to Isaac, "Go away from us." It's kind of important to notice Abimelech in this. He says, "Go away from us, for you are too powerful for us." And Isaac departed from there and camped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. So he moves into this territory where Abimelech is. There's this earlier there was the lie that complicated things. And then Abimelech is also kind of feeling a little uneasy because Isaac is so wealthy, but also there's this contention over these wells. So Abimelech in verse 16 says, "Just please, we need some distance here. Get away from me." Verse 18. Then Isaac dug again the wells of water which had been dug in the days of his father, Abraham, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham, and he gave them the same names which his father had given them. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of flowing water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with the herdsmen of Isaac, saying, "The water is ours." So he named the well Esek, because they contended with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over it too. So he named it Sitnah. He moved away from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he named it Rehoboth. For he said, "At last the Lord has made room for us, and we will be fruitful in the land." Then he went up from there to Beersheba. The Lord appeared to him the same night and said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." So he built an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. So there's that issue with the guys that follow Abimelech. But notice this. Here we go. Here's in Genesis 26, verse 26. Then, this is kind of interesting what Abimelech does next. Then Abimelech came to him from Gerar with his advisor Huzath, Philcol, the commander of his army. Isaac said to them, "Why have you come to me?" Remember, this is the same guy earlier that said, "Get away from me." So Isaac's, it's understandable in verse 27. Isaac said to them, "Why have you come to me since you hate me and have sent me away from you?" They said, "We see plainly that the Lord has been with you." So we said, "Let there now be an oath between us, even between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you and have done to you nothing but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord." Then he made them a feast, and they ate and drank. In the morning they arose early and exchanged oaths. Then Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. And I find this very interesting, especially that there was so much conflict of interest. Despite all that, the conflict of ideals and just general conflict, it's very clear to Abimelech that Isaac has something that he doesn't. At the very least, he wanted to be on peaceful terms with him. This is during the exile. Later, if you jump over to Zechariah chapter 8, and as you're looking up Zechariah 8, just keep Abimelech in mind. He's looking at Isaac, and he says, "Get away from me, and I'll like you." Isaac even thinks that he hates him. But later he comes up, he says, I can see you have something I don't. I can see that God is with you. And so that kind of jumps out at me. Notice a similar idea years later when all the Israelites are hauled off to Babylon, and then Persia comes into power, and they're returning to the promised land to rebuild everything. And what's going to happen is that as they're getting things back up and running again, the people around of the world are going to notice this. And this is how it's described in Zechariah 8:20. Zechariah chapter 8, verse 20. "Thus says the Lord of hosts, it will yet be that peoples will come, even the inhabitants of many cities. The inhabitants of one will go to another, saying, 'Let us go at once to entreat the favor of the Lord, and to seek the Lord of hosts. I will also go.' So many peoples and mighty nations will come to seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem and to entreat the favor of the Lord." So notice that as they get things up and running in Jerusalem, the world's going to notice and they're going to be drawn to that. But look at verse 23. "Thus the Lord of hosts says, in those days 10 men from all the nations will grasp the garment of a Jew, saying, 'Let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you.'" And it makes me think of what happened with Abimelech and Isaac. He says, "There's something about you. I can tell you've got backing. Somebody's got you covered, and I can see it in your life." And the same is going on with here. All kinds of conflict, but eventually the people approach because they see that God is with them. Now, under the Old Covenant, a lot of what God accomplished with his presence is seen through miraculous events. The same power is in play today, but through the Word. And when the Word is active in a person, like us as Christians, it's going to be very noticeable. That's why I asked Rocky to read Matthew 5:14. Read it one more time with me with all this in mind, because the world's going to notice. "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who's in heaven." I really believe that just like Abimelech saw something in Isaac, and that the people in the enemy territory saw something in the people of God when they're rebuilding Jerusalem, people will see something in you. And there may be contention to begin with. Some of the very people who are antagonistic about your stand on Christianity will be the very ones who will later come to you and say that there's something about you, something that you have that I don't. That's why it's so important to be like Jesus. Not to just seem like a Christian, but to really be light. In class this morning, we mentioned Colossians 1:13. "For he rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins." So I'm going to tell you a story about a friend of mine in Germany. You'll notice that when you're in the domain of darkness, and that's all you've ever known, when you leave that place and you're heading towards the light can kind of be annoying, but it's your only hope of escape. We had friends of family who lived in Germany. He was in the army, and he was American stationed in Stuttgart, Germany, and he was a higher up kind of guy. And this is back when, before the USSR fell. And if you don't know this, Berlin once was two cities in one. And if you lived in East Berlin, you were under communist rule, and people would try to get past the wall, the famous Berlin Wall, because if you could just get to West Berlin, you could get away and be free again. So people were constantly eyeing that wall, trying to figure out a way past it. Well, our friend, I think he was a colonel, if I remember right, and he told us that when he would go, he would have clearance to go to East Berlin. And he was in a different situation because he could go and visit East Berlin and then he could leave, whereas he was surrounded by people trapped there, desperate to leave and get to West Berlin. And he said it was interesting is once in a while, a man or a young man or something like that would come up to him and stare at him, almost as if he was just an object. And they would study him. And they were eyeing him from head to foot. I mean, like this far away. They wouldn't say anything. They were just studying him. And what they were doing is they were memorizing his uniform. They were trying to figure out the exact details so that they could duplicate it and maybe escape. And he said it was kind of ominous to be standing there where he could so easily walk away. And they were desperate for even a crumb of information so that they could fashion some semblance of what he had in order to get out of there and escape. And I think about that once in a while because they were prisoners and they were planning their escape. And that's our situation. We live in a city filled with prisoners. That's why it's so very important to put on Christ. Galatians 3:27 says, "For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ." It's a lot like that uniform. It's freedom. We wear him to make sure that we don't become prisoners again. And we wear him also because we are the one hope that the prisoners have. Because if they see something in us, we're their hope of escaping this domain of darkness for themselves. In some form, one way or the other, they will eventually say, "We see plainly that the Lord has been with you." It's really important that, as always, that we take who we are here out there. Out into East Berlin, so to speak, and people will be watching. And a lot of it is because they're watching to see if there is hope in this world. And if you're wearing that hope and living that hope, it's going to have a huge impact. If you have not been baptized, according to Galatians 3:27, that means you haven't been clothed with Christ. So that means you're still in the domain of darkness. That's the only conclusion I can reach. But I would encourage you, if you have not made that decision, to make that an opportunity for you right now. You have the chance to escape. And we would encourage you to do that as we stand together and sing.
My hope is built on
Nothing less than